Hey, this is A.D. Martinez, author of The Last Adventure of Constance Verity, and you're listening to So Booking Cool with Jewel B.
Welcome to So Booking Cool, it's Jewel B. Today's guest is an award-winning author who has written countless fantasy and sci-fi fiction, including Gil's All-Fright Diner, The Automatic Detective, In the Company of Ogres, and the recently announced feature film adaptation of The Last Adventure of Constance Verity. He is A. Lee Martinez. So first of all, congratulations, A. Lee. How do you feel?
Oh, well, it's okay. Well, first of all, I'm not writing the adaptation. I wrote the book. There was somebody else writing the adaptation. But, I mean, a part of this big part of this business is just kind of waiting and seeing. So, I'm cautiously optimistic. That's the way I kind of survive mentally.
Right, right. Yeah, you're the author of the book.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a two-book series. Will there be a third? Do we know yet?
Yeah, it's a trilogy. So I'm working on the third book now.
That's awesome. So, how did this idea come to you for this trilogy?
Oh, well, I mean, partly was just I just let my previous publisher and my agent got in touch with this Simon Schuster, and they went to work with me. And I really like old pulp adventure stories, and I wanted to do sort of a homage to that of the sort of classic. They weren't superheroes, but they were sort of like the character who could do everything, who would like have these weird adventures, and got to the point that they could like they're super skilled and super capable, and kind of wanted to explore that in a modern day setting. Because a lot of times when I write something, it's based on something that annoys me, and it kind of annoys me that people are like, "Well, you can't have characters that are good at everything." I was like, "Well, what if I make a character who's pretty good at everything, and she still has to like deal with her problems?"
Yeah, that's interesting because they call those kind of characters a Mary Sue, right?
Well,
Am I
yes,
right?
the Mary Sue character comes from fan fiction, and what makes a Mary Sue isn't a character necessarily that can do everything. It's a character that is beloved by everybody. That's sort of a Mary Sue. There's a similar. This is sometimes it gets misapplied a lot now. Like somebody will call like Rey from Star Wars a Mary Sue, but I'm like, well, yeah, she's really super capable, but Luke Skywalker in the first movie goes from a farm boy to the guy who destroyed the Death Star. So I don't really think she's more capable than Luke Skywalker. It's just interesting dynamic that gets applied. So she's not so much. I mean, I've somebody who I'm sure will some call her Constance Verity and Mary Sue, but she's more of a Doc Savage, the Shadow, those kind of characters that are just really those old school characters that could basically do everything.
How did you develop her? Like, did you write out certain traits or characteristics, or was it all in your head? Like, how was she created?
Oh well, I do a lot of my writing kind of on the fly, and then it's in editing that I kind of discover like smooth it out and make it make sense. So I knew that the idea that she would be like a really capable person who kind of is stuck in adventures constantly. The rest I kind of just developed as I went. I tend not to think too far in advance. I kind of go and then I work afterwards. In the editing process is when I like refine and discover like the things I like and the things I don't like, and take those out and I modify those.
And you mentioned that one of the things that inspires your writing are things that you get annoyed by. I'd also like to know more about that and what gets your creative juices flowing as a writer, especially as someone who's been in the industry for more than 20 years.
Well, I think I've only been like professionally 16 years, maybe. Just um,
Oh.
I don't know. I mean, the big question in any artist suffers is, am I doing something that's going to reach people? And I've always kind of struggled with that. I mean, I'm doing fairly good right now, but who knows? But you know, for me, it's ultimately comes down to write something that I'd be interested in reading, and if I'm lucky, it's either something that I think there isn't enough of, or that I like a lot, and then I don't mind if there's more of it. So for me, I really love like crazy ideas, like big, weird science fiction ideas, fantasy ideas, and so that's a big inspiration. And then it's just kind of like, can I make this engaging and interesting to everybody? That's sort of my goal every time I'm writing. But at the start, I'm always trying to write something. First of all, I think a writer generally you should write something that you're interested in, because you can write something you hate and it's not guaranteed to sell, so you're just making yourself miserable. But after that, I try to think of something that my goal is to make something that's accessible and interesting that also is kind of unique, which is always kind of a balance, but that's really the inspiration most of the time.
Do you remember, Ailey, the first piece of advice that you got when you entered into the publishing world?
I don't remember the first piece of advice. I mean, I do remember one that really stuck with me, and that's there's a writer named Jane Lindskold, and I was at a author like publisher thing together, and I remember she read my first book, and she just wrote me back a nice email, and it was really really nice. And I said, "Oh, thanks. It's really good to hear from people who have made it." And she gave me this best advice I ever got, which is, she goes, "Well, just remember, you've never really made it. It's always sort of one book at a time." And I think that's true of the creative fields. Is yeah, okay, Stephen King probably doesn't have to worry about that, but the rest of us, it's one book at a time. Like, even this movie stuff is great, and I'm very excited about it, but I'm also kind of like, it's just another step that I've got to go through, and it may not go anywhere, and I got to go somewhere else. So it's a constant. It's never to be discouraged, but also realize there's going to be a lot of discouragement.
Well, by the way, I'm very curious, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners too, and certainly your fans and your audience and new listeners and audiences of yours want to know, what are some of the challenges, or the biggest challenges that you feel that you have overcome throughout your career?
Well, overcoming's tricky because there's still, like, one of my biggest challenges, just like any other, is I am a procrastinator, so it's easy for me to fall behind on my work. I still struggle with that. I mean, the big challenge that I've overcome at this stage is I'm finally sort of past the wall, so I'm in the industry, so it's a little different when I'm writing something to know that, like, somebody like might be interested in it. But I don't know. I mean, I think every challenge just keeps sticking around, and it maybe lessens or grows, but I don't know if I've, as much as I feel like I've made a lot. I mean, I feel I'm a lot more confident in my writing. I was always happy with my writing, but now after 12 books and at least doing okay, I'm like, okay, somebody's going to be interested in what I'm writing. So I feel a little more confident in that, but I don't feel as if, there are times where I still feel like it's kind of weird to do this job and still feel like an outsider. It's a constant. I feel like growth is difficult, but I do feel like I feel less like an imposter when I do it.
That's really interesting, because I've had a conversation like that with another novelist, Daniel Jose Older. That's really interesting.
I'm sure it's very universal.
Why is it that it's like a universal?
Well, I mean, now again, it might be different for different arts, although I think it's the same. One of the things that's interesting about, like, writing, especially novels, is you spend all this time alone working on this, and then eventually you have your editorial feedback, and I have a writer's workshop I'm a member of, but it's still, there's a lot of time when you're working on something and you're not getting a lot of feedback. So like, if you're a musician and you go out and you perform and you get a crowd and the crowd applauds, you're like, okay, I think I'm good at this. A lot of times, especially when you start writing, you're just writing and you're hoping somebody's going to like it. And so even now, like, when I write something, and I'm working on the third book, which I'm sure I'm fairly positive will be well received. I think it's good, but it still feels like this, like, limbo state, because it's not out yet. I haven't talked to my editor yet. There's a lot of things that it's not finalized even close to that. And I think that sort of creative, like I said, limbo is where I think writing is kind of an interesting job in that way. And it can lead to a lot of, you feel like you're in between a lot.
So how should an author keep herself or themselves motivated?
Well, I think the thing that I always come back to, and I still struggle with it, is it's just one, like, if you're a novelist, one novel at a time. I mean, sometimes everyone has different techniques, so find what works. That's the first one. Like, some people like working on more than one novel at a time, as long as they get their novels finished. That's a good way to do it. So find what works. That's the most important. Like, pay attention to your feedback. Like, if you find you can't, like, I'm going to write in the evening, and you never write in the evening, stop trying to do that. If you find that, like, you're terrible, but, like, the last the last weekend of the month is when you're most productive. Well, let's just plan for that. So that's the first part. But also just realize that the part of it's always a next step, and the next step is always just something you can't control. You just do a lot of your work. You just do the best work you can, and hope it'll kind of pay out. And do the right steps. Do your research. Know where to go to submit. Know the process. Know what to expect, and that helps a lot too, because it's still going to be frustrating, but it's going to be a lot less frustrating than if you're going blind.
Is it important, do you think, for fantasy and or sci-fi writers to like study that genre or read other books in that genre?
Well, I think it's important for writers to read books of all genres, and I think one of the mistakes people make is assuming there's not a lot of crossover, because I think there's a lot of crossover across the board. There's like not every one of my novels, but a lot of my novels have a romantic element, or some have a mystery element, or have and sometimes they're not even just good writing. Just good writing is you can learn a lot from, even if you don't necessarily apply it to your own writing directly. So it just depends on. I do think be exposed, but again, I will say also that the risk is if you find being exposed is like slowing you down because you're taking too much time reading and not enough time writing. Well, then you've got to make a choice and maybe not to read as much. So it depends again on your experience. But of course, it always helps to see good artists and learn from them, because you can learn a lot by seeing something that works.
Yeah.
And you can learn a lot by seeing something that doesn't work.
Right. Yeah. Well, in general, what would you say doesn't work in fiction
Well,
writing?
everything works if it's done well. Now, I think there are things that are, I don't want to say higher skill level, but more difficult to pull off. And so when I see a new writer try those things, a lot of time they're kind of biting off too much. I think at the beginning, new writers tend to put too much into the plot, like make the plot too complicated. And I think you can always simplify and then build up. I think the new writer mistakes is not concentrating enough on your characters, over-explaining. I think people over-explain when they start writing, and not knowing where a scene starts or ends. Those are the kind of the basics. But I think anything can work if it's done well, and also if you can find the audience for it. I mean, there's plenty of books that are very popular that I don't like very much, but I'm not going to deny their popularity. And but I think the most basic thing when a writer starts is it's all right to be ambitious, but kind of get your basic framework down, get your basic craft and ability down, and then you can kind of start experimenting. Although, again, experimenting is just part of the process, and you might learn a lot just by failing.
Yeah, and speaking of the craft, do you think it matters how many books an author has written? Like yourself, you've done many books, you've done 12 books, and you started writing when you were around 17 years old. But when you have that experience, should you still be looking for ways to grow as a writer?
Well, I mean, I think technically I'm going to say even as an artist, I'm just saying people should always be looking for a chance to grow and become better. I mean, I think the mistake you can run into, like I feel like after doing this for as long as I have, I feel like I've got a pretty good grasp on a lot of elements of storytelling, and writing, and it's kind of a weird thing to think about, but I realize that I've absorbed a lot of it. But I also think I can always be better. I can always improve. I can always grow. So I think there's nothing wrong with being confident in yourself, again, because you should. If you feel like you've done something well, be proud of it. Be confident. But I think the danger is thinking it. Like one of my things is, even at my writer's workshop, I always downplay like what level of success I've gotten, because I don't want someone to think that, well, that advice I didn't like that advice, but I should take it from him because he knows what he's doing. Because at the end of the day, there's still a ton of luck. I mean, even this movie stuff is a ton of luck. There's a lot of things that went on behind the scenes that have nothing to do with me. And so I think even though you can feel confident because you're like, I know better what I'm doing, I think anytime you say, I've mastered this, you're probably in a bad spot.
And I love what you said, that in general, like people should be looking to grow and get better. I meant to say like amen to that. Amen.
Yeah, I mean we're all dumb, and even when we get smarter, we're still dumb.
So in general, would you say that you're the kind of person who's always like looking to learn?
Yeah, I mean I'd like to think so. I mean, again, the problem is how do we know ourselves? I mean, I love I love reading nonfiction. I love thinking about character. I mean, I like window for one of the reasons I like writing stories is you can talk about like abstract ideas in interesting ways. I mean, my goal is I don't know again how well I do it because you can't always tell yourself, but I try to be a better person than I was, even a year ago. And there are times when I see myself in the past and I'm like, well, I was dumb back then, but that's how it works. If you, I always worry if I don't look back at my past, like if I look back at like 2 years ago or 3 years ago and don't think of me doing something kind of stupid, then I was like, well, maybe either I've mastered my life or I haven't grown enough. And that's, I mean, of those two options, I just think the mastered one is the less likely.
When it comes to fiction writing, should there ever be a balance between the author being very imaginative and then doing a lot of research to make sure that the facts are like the facts are there? Yeah, how much of it should be imaginative versus like having experience, maybe your own experiences or maybe experiences from other people, and then research for the facts?
Okay, well, a lot of it depends on what you're talking about. Like for me, there's a lot of elements in stories that I don't care about realism, and I think realism is a detriment. And somebody worries too much about realism, it gets in the way because stories aren't reality; they're fiction. Where I think you run into weird situations to me is where you get into sensitive territory or accidentally surreal territory. Like if somebody, like the best way I can put it is like if you're going to write a crime story, you don't necessarily need to know about what real cops and real detectives do. But if you've never watched or read a detective novel, you're probably going to write a weird story that doesn't really work. But like other elements are, of course, when it comes to like sensitivity or like I'm kind of think there are times that somebody will be like, well, I'm going to write this character that's outside of my sensitivity and out of my experience. And I mean, we all do that as writers, so that's not a bad thing. But where they sort of have a stubborn resolve to be like, I did it right, don't challenge me, I get a little frustrated by that. Because I think anybody can write outside their experience if they do it well. But and then there's other things that are, I mean, it's silly, but there are things that like, if you're going to write about like nuclear power, at least know a little bit about nuclear power. But on the other hand, I think a lot of stuff isn't that important. Like, earlier today I was talking to somebody and they were talking about like an elevator scene and they were like, well, the emergency call button doesn't really work like that. I said, yeah, but it works like that in every story, so who cares? So stuff like that, that's a fine line between the two. And like I borrow a lot from, fantasy and science fiction, and there's a lot of elements of that. Like I don't mind borrowing like from cultures like with weird monsters and stuff like that, or gods or whatever, and I'll put my own spin on it. And I don't feel like it's necessarily important for me to be accurate to things I consider fictional. But there is also a line where you can, but it's also kind of clear that I'm doing that. So I'm not trying to say like, look at this thing I'm doing, like look how progressive I am, and that can change into problems too. So there's a lot of stuff. Ultimately, does it work or not? But I think usually when you're stepping on somebody's toes, it's pretty obvious.
What are some of the best film adaptations you think have been made from books?
Oof. That's a tough one. I mean, I think it's weird. I know it's going to be a weird one, but like I think The Devil Wears Prada is a really good adaptation because it actually takes a story I think that's pretty kind of not. It's okay, but I think it makes it into a more of a traditional story, and does a better job of it. What else was I thinking of? I don't know. I mean, like I think Christine is a nice novel. I think the story is really good. The movie's really good. I mean, a lot of times they're different mediums, so I think it works best when you translate across the mediums and don't do it shot for shot, direct. I mean, like Harry Potter is huge, and those books are sprawling, and I think the movies do a pretty good job of condensing them into movie form. I mean, The Lord of the Rings is super popular, and I'm not as much as it's heresy to say that, I'm not a huge fan of the books. I'm not a huge fan of the movies either, so I guess they do a good job. Sometimes you can get in weird adaptations, but a lot of times if you're trying to do a shot for shot, like a page for page adaptation, there's plenty of good adaptations. Like I'm hoping, like I don't necessarily need for the Constance Verity movie to be exactly like the book. In fact, if it's very different like the book, but I think it's a good movie, I'll be happy. And if it's exactly like the book, but I just feel like it's not a good translation, like stuff that works great on the page may not work on the screen, then I won't necessarily be. I mean, I'll still be happy because I made a movie. But
Right. Any thoughts at all on Awkwafina?
oh, I mean, she's from what I've seen, she's pretty cool, and she seems like very interested in the project, and so I'm like, I'm all for that. And it's funny when I created Constance now in the books, there's not an exactly description of her, but the cover artist came up with the version in the on the books in America, which is that sort of like Hispanic Asian kind of mix, and so I always kind of like that idea because I was like, yeah, because I part of what I wanted to do is I wanted to do sort of a traditional like super pulp hero, but like there's not a lot of women that are well known, so I kind of wanted to do that. And when he did that with her, the artist made her look like ethnic, and I'm Mexican, and I was like, that was cool. And so Awkwafina, I'm like, well, that's cool because this is another chance for a kind of classic traditional hero to get a new expand that face and how we see them. So I'm all for that.
Yes. How has things changed at all since the announcement came out for the movie?
Well, it's only been like a week, so things haven't changed incredibly. The weirdest part is there's been a boost in sales, and the weirdest part is that, like, occasionally, more people know my name. But again, I'm a writer. Nobody knows. Very few people know me on site, so it's not like people are walking up and going like, "Hey, you're Andy Martinez." So really, that's again goes back to what I was talking about. Like, even though there's a change, it's not really a change. Mm-hmm. Like even my internet presence has not been particularly excited. So it's like the weird part about this job is the changes happen, but they're kind of happening behind the scenes even to me. So.
Oh yes, that's so well said as well. Yeah, that's.
Well, I'm a writer.
That's right. Yeah. What would be your playlist for? You could do a playlist for like all your titles, just in books. Of like, what would be the playlist for your characters?
Oh well, I'm not really a huge music guy.
Oh really?
No, not really. I mean, I listen to some music, but it's mostly pretty easy. I mean, some of them is kind of some of it's kind of obvious. Like I love like some of my novels. Like for example, my character Automatic Detective is sort of a retro robot detective story, and it's very much like designed like in the it's nebulously set in between a time between like the 20s and the 50s, kind of vaguely. So like that playlist would be all like jazz and like smoky, and then probably put a little bit of like synthesizer in it just because to make it robotic. Other ones, I mean, like my first novel, Girls Off Right Diner, would have a country soundtrack because that fits very well with that. So it just depends on the story, but most of the stories I don't think about music very much. Kind of weird.
Are you more like into old school music, like just not the music out now?
No. Well, I'm not really into a lot of music, so I listen. Like I'll listen, and the great thing about now is I'll go to like online and they'll suggest things. So I actually am probably more in touch with music than I used to be. But it just varies. I'm not really. I like old school music. I like newer stuff. I mean, I don't like all the old stuff. It's very. I don't want to say eclectic because that implies that it's like esoteric and crazy. I'm pretty much just when I write, I tend to listen to alternative or soundtracks, movie soundtracks, because they don't have words, so it's just like a cool. Like right now, I'm really enjoying the Godzilla King of the Monsters soundtrack. I think it's a really solid, like orchestral score and stuff like that.
That's great. Do you, when you watch a movie? I know you saw The Angry Birds recently.
Yeah. Yes.
Did that movie have a score by any chance?
Yeah, it had a score. Well, that one had a pop music score, so okay. Which always is kind of iffy, but it worked pretty well because they picked appropriate songs. I am not a huge fan of necessarily pop music scores if they're just thrown in there because they're popular. But the Angry Birds kind of did it with intent, and I thought it worked pretty well. But otherwise, like I said, like King of the Monsters is a great like orchestral score, and even as like an homage to the classic like themes of those movies, of those monster movies, Godzilla. and like I love those. Those are beautiful songs that I think they've updated really well.
What would you tell your younger self, knowing like what you know now as a writer? Like, let's say when you were 17 and you wrote your first book.
Well, when I was 17, so it took me like 13 years before I got my first book published. So, I mean, I would just say hang in there. I mean, uh, you know, I mean, it's kind of, I'm in this position right now where I feel very lucky and things are working out for the moment. And I'm also very lucky. You know, I've been married 10 years with my wife and everything's going great.
Awesome.
And I found her late in life, but you know, everything's going cool. And, I feel like I'm lucky in a lot of ways. So the main thing I feel is, don't be dumb and, just hang in there. But I've been very lucky. Like I was lucky. I've always been lucky enough to have like a lot of really great support around me that made it possible. I mean, again, that's the luck factor because a lot of people who are very talented don't have that, and it's a lot harder. So, I mean, the only advice I'd ever give is I guess if I gave one piece of advice, it would be my first book. There's some fat shaming jokes that I'm not really happy about anymore. And I wish they weren't in there. So if I could just go back and do like, don't put those in, dude. Just take those out. Don't put those in. That's stupid.
A. Lee Martinez. You know, it was so great talking with you, A. Lee. I know I told you 15 minutes initially.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. That's cool.
So I'm glad that like you stuck it out. I mean, it was really great to talk to you. I mean, there's a lot that could be discussed with you. I want to even put in a bonus question. Who are some authors that you would love to have dinner with?
Oh, see, now if you'd ask me like my favorite writers, that's a different thing.
Yeah, writers too. That's fine.
I know, but I'm always like, I don't know if I want to meet my heroes.
Oh yeah, with this.
You never know. I've been very lucky, by the way. I've met a lot of writers that I admire, and they've almost all of them have been really cool and nice. Which is I've kind of learned to accept that like, oh yeah, most writers who make it in this business are actually pretty cool. But I'm always still worried about meeting people. Even when people meet me, I'm always worried about like if it's some kind of public events, which I don't go to a lot, but if I go to one and someone's like, oh, I'm excited to see you, I'm like, oh God, I hope I don't let you down. So, I mean, my favorite writer is Edgar Rice Burroughs because I love like old pulp adventure novels. He wrote like Tarzan and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. And I just love those novels. But he's, it was a different era. He was in the 20s and 50s, so he'd probably be like a different person. I guess if I could pick one, I'd pick Walt Simonson, who's a hugely influential comic book writer for me. He was writing Thor in the 80s, and that was probably the comic that's like his whole run on that still influences me today. And I think I've seen him on Twitter, and he seems like a cool dude. So I think I'd like to meet him.
There we go. I'm sure he'd love to meet you too.
Fingers crossed.
Yes, fingers crossed. Yeah, so best of luck with everything. It was great to talk with you. Everybody, make sure you check out all his series, and who knows, like it might be another one of your titles that will be adapted into a film or a show. Yeah,
that's right. Who knows?
So how can people keep up with you?
I'm on Twitter at A. Lee Martinez. I have a website. I don't update very often, but I do put free short fiction on it, aleemartinez.com. You can reach me on my email is hipstercthulhu@hotmail.com. Cthulhu's spelled CTHULHU. And I have a Facebook page, but Facebook's been kind of wonky for me lately, so I don't update it a lot. But I do have a facebook.com/A. Lee Martinez Action Force. So anyway, if you look for me, you can find me. Those are the best places to find me.
Awesome, and I would love to talk with you again in the future.
I'd love to be on again.
Thank you very much, and thank you as well to all the listeners. Until next time, so booking cool.
Hey, this is A. Lee Martinez, author of The Last Adventure of Constance Verity, and you're listening to So Booking Cool with Jewel B.